The cold in the Ardennes forest during January of 1945 was not just a temperature. It was a physical presence. It seeped through wool greatcoats and multiple layers of clothing as if they were made of gauze. It turned the damp earth of the foxholes into frozen iron, stealing warmth from a man's body with relentless efficiency. The air itself felt sharp, crystallizing in the lungs with every desperate breath. For the men of the 28th Infantry Division, stalled near the German border, the enemy wasn't just the one with rifles and mortars hiding in the endless snow-draped pines. The more immediate enemy was the cold, an invisible killer that stalked them every hour of every day, but especially during the long, black nights. It was a cold that made metal stick to bare skin, that turned a simple canteen of water into a useless block of ice, and that made the simple act of pulling a trigger an agonizing challenge for numb, unresponsive fingers. Private First Class James Wilson, a 22-year-old rifleman from a small town outside Cleveland, Ohio, felt this enemy in his bones. He watched his comrades, men who had survived brutal firefights, now shivering uncontrollably in their holes, their faces pale and their spirits eroding with each passing hour. The standard issue wool blankets felt like thin sheets against a cold that dropped to impossible lows. They couldn't light open fires. The faintest flicker of a flame or the smallest wisp of smoke would be an engraved invitation for German artillery to erase their position from the map. They were trapped, forced to choose between freezing slowly in silence or dying quickly in a flash of light and fire. Wilson, a practical kid raised during the Great Depression and trained as a Boy Scout, knew that survival wasn't about enduring the impossible. It was about changing the rules of the game. He knew something the others didn't. Buried in his memory was a lesson from a world away, a simple trick taught by his old scoutmaster that seemed almost childishly simple amidst the industrial scale of war. It was a technique for creating heat from literal garbage, a method that produced no smoke and required no Army-issued fuel. But in a place where officers dismissed anything not found in a field manual, his idea would be seen as a fool's errand, a kid's toy. What he didn't know was that this forgotten piece of knowledge would be the only thing standing between his squad and freezing to death. On this channel, we unearth the survival knowledge that was tested in the harshest conditions and then deliberately forgotten. Subscribe so you never miss these vital lessons. For James Wilson, the choice was simple. Trust the official methods that were failing everyone, or trust a memory that might just get them through the night. The situation on the Western Front in January of 1945 was one of brutal, frozen inertia. The massive German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge had slammed into the Allied advance, stalling it completely in the dense, snow-choked Ardennes forest. For the men of the 28th Infantry Division, this wasn't a war of movement anymore. It was a war of attrition fought from holes scraped into the unforgiving, frozen earth. Every day was a mirror of the last. Hold the line, endure the shelling, and try not to freeze. The forest itself had become a prison of skeletal trees draped in white, their branches heavy with snow that muffled every sound except the chilling howl of the wind and the distant crump of artillery. This wasn't a temporary halt, it felt permanent. They were caught in a vice, squeezed on one side by a desperate enemy and on the other by a winter so severe it felt like a conscious, malevolent force bent on their destruction. The Army's conventional solutions were failing catastrophically. The standard issue wool greatcoats and blankets, designed for a different kind of cold, were porous against the damp, penetrating chill of the Ardennes. They became heavy with moisture and then froze, turning into stiff shells of ice that offered little insulation. The real tools for warmth, the precious kerosene heaters, were a distant dream for the frontline riflemen. They were loud, produced a visible glow, and were strictly reserved for the warmth of command posts and the critical needs of field hospitals far behind the lines. The men in the foxholes were left with nothing. Their only official instruction was to huddle together for body heat, a grim tactic that turned a small group into a perfect target for a single, well-aimed mortar round. They were given tools for fighting a human enemy, but against the relentless siege of the cold, they had been left utterly defenseless by the very system meant to protect them. The consequences were immediate and horrific. Frostbite wasn't a risk, it was a certainty. Men would wake from a few minutes of fitful sleep to find their fingers and toes had turned a waxy, dead white, the feeling gone completely. You could see the fear in their eyes as they tried to massage life back into flesh that no longer felt like their own. Hypothermia was a silent predator, draining a soldier's strength, slowing his thoughts, and eroding his will to fight until he simply laid down and gave up. Combat readiness plummeted as morale dissolved. The greatest danger came at night, during sentry duty. A man, exhausted and numb, could easily drift off to sleep in the suffocating cold, a fatal mistake that would leave his entire unit exposed to a surprise attack. This wasn't a matter of comfort. It was a simple, brutal calculation. Every night that passed, the cold claimed more men than enemy bullets. Something had to change, and it had to change now. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It had become a predator, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness, trying to lull him into a sleep from which he knew he would not wake. It was in this moment of absolute despair, with his body trembling uncontrollably, that a memory surfaced in James Wilson's mind, clear and warm as a summer afternoon. He was a teenager again, standing in the snow of a winter campout in Ohio, listening to his scoutmaster, Mr. Peterson. Peterson was a veteran of the First War, a man with eyes that had seen too much, but a voice that still held a core of unshakable calm. He held up a rusty can. "The Army gives you gear," Peterson had said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "But the wild gives you problems the gear was never designed for. True survival isn't about what you carry, but what you can make from the junk others leave behind." The memory was so vivid Wilson could almost smell the pine wood smoke from their long-extinguished campfire. It wasn't a random memory. It was a lifeline. He looked around his foxhole with new eyes. What was once just frozen refuse was now a collection of resources. An empty ration can, discarded after a meager meal. A wooden ammunition crate, its sides lined with corrugated cardboard for padding. The congealed bacon grease in the bottom of a mess kit, which most men simply scraped away and buried. He began to work, his movements slow and clumsy with numb fingers. He carefully tore strips of the cardboard, rolling them into a tight, dense spiral, like a child making a paper snail. He worked until the spiral was just wide enough to fit snugly inside the empty ration can. His foxhole buddies watched him in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. To them, he was a man on the edge, playing with trash. To Wilson, he was following a blueprint laid down years ago by a man who had survived a different frozen hell. The cardboard wasn't trash. It was a giant wick, waiting for its fuel. The next step was the key. He gathered the leftover grease from his own rations and quietly asked his squad mates for theirs. They gave it to him without question, too cold and tired to care about the strange request. He carefully melted the fat over a tiny, shielded flame from a Zippo lighter, just enough to turn the white solid into a golden liquid. Then, he poured it slowly over the cardboard coil in the can. The dry paper drank the grease greedily, the liquid seeping into every pore and channel until it was completely saturated. The principle Mr. Peterson had explained was simple but brilliant. This wasn't a wood fire, which burns hot, fast, and produces a torrent of smoke. This was controlled, low-intensity combustion. The grease was a dense, slow-burning fuel, and the vast surface area of the cardboard acted as a massive wick, ensuring the fuel burned evenly and for hours. The metal can would contain the small flame, absorb its energy, and then radiate it outward as steady, consistent heat. Critically, it would be almost completely smokeless. With the device assembled, a moment of truth arrived. He placed the can on the floor of the foxhole, struck his lighter, and touched the flame to the greasy wick. It sputtered for a second before catching, producing not a blaze, but a small, steady, almost silent flame that danced an inch above the cardboard. There was no plume of smoke, no loud crackle, just a quiet glow. At first, his buddies were unimpressed. But then, slowly, a wave of gentle warmth began to push back against the oppressive cold. It wasn't a roaring fire, but it was enough. The razor-sharp edge of the air softened. The feeling began to return to their fingers and toes. One by one, they shuffled closer, extending their hands toward the little can as if it were a religious relic. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the shivering stopped. They were not warm, not by any comfortable standard, but they were no longer freezing to death. Their fragile sanctuary was shattered by the arrival of a lieutenant colonel on a late-night inspection. The officer, bundled in a clean greatcoat that had never seen the inside of a foxhole, peered down into their position. His eyes fell upon the small, glowing can. A look of utter contempt crossed his face. "What is this?" he snapped, his voice sharp with disdain. "Are we playing games, Private?" Before Wilson could explain, the officer scoffed. "Get rid of that thing. Stop wasting your time with kids' toys and keep your eyes on the enemy." He moved on without another word, leaving a wake of cold authority. The men in the foxhole looked at each other, then back at the small heater that was the only thing keeping them functional. The officer saw garbage. They felt life. In that moment, the choice became clear. The official methods were failing them, and official wisdom was a death sentence. The lieutenant colonel's dismissal did not end the experiment. It solidified its importance. As soon as his footsteps faded into the crunching snow, Wilson's foxhole buddy, a corporal named Miller, looked at the can and then at Wilson. "Make me one of those," he said, his voice a low whisper. It was not a request. It was a plea. The ridicule from above had an unintended effect. It didn't expose the device as a foolish toy. It exposed the leadership as being dangerously disconnected from the reality of their suffering. That night, no one in Wilson's foxhole got rid of their heater. The next morning, wordlessly, the entire squad began collecting cans and saving their grease. They worked in secret, building their kids' toys out of sight, preparing for the coming night. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion, born not of insubordination, but of the primal, undeniable will to survive. The real test was yet to come, a wave of Arctic air that would soon descend upon the forest and show who was truly wasting their time. The real test arrived not as a single storm, but as a siege. An Arctic front descended upon the Ardennes, a malevolent wave of polar air that plunged the forest into a new level of frozen hell. For 5 consecutive days, the world seemed to stop. The temperature plummeted below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and a relentless wind howled through the skeletal trees, driving the cold into every crack and seam of their defenses. Snow fell not in soft flakes, but in tiny, sharp crystals that stung any exposed skin. Metal became brittle, wood cracked with the sound of gunshots, and the very air felt thin and sharp in the lungs. For the men huddled in their foxholes, this was no longer a battle against a human enemy. It was a war against the planet itself. Every other unit was reporting that the cold was winning, that men were simply ceasing to function. For James Wilson's platoon, this was the moment of truth. The kids' toys were about to face an enemy that no field manual had ever prepared them for. The contrast between survival and destruction became brutally clear over the crackle of the field radios. The reports coming in from other companies were a litany of suffering. Men were found at their posts, conscious but unable to move, their limbs frozen solid. 3 platoons reported critical cold weather casualties, their fighting strength crippled without a single shot being fired. The medics were overwhelmed. In just those 5 days, 11 men from the rest of the company were evacuated from the front lines, their bodies ravaged by severe hypothermia and frostbite. 2 of them, it was later confirmed, would lose fingers and toes to the surgeon's blade. But in the sector held by Wilson's platoon, there was an eerie quiet. Inside their foxholes, a different story was unfolding. The small, steady flames of their tin can heaters pushed back the killing cold. They rotated through their shelters, drying their socks, keeping their weapons functional, and maintaining a core of warmth that kept their minds sharp and their morale intact. The final tally was stark and undeniable. 11 casualties in the surrounding units, 0 in theirs. On the 3rd day of the Arctic blast, the lieutenant colonel returned. He wasn't on a routine inspection. He was investigating an anomaly. Every other unit was reporting catastrophic failure, yet one platoon remained fully operational. He moved through their positions, his face grim, expecting to find men on the verge of collapse. Instead, he found soldiers who were alert. Their eyes were clear. They weren't shivering uncontrollably. They moved with purpose. His gaze fell upon the small, glowing cans in every foxhole, the very garbage he had dismissed days earlier. This time, there was no contempt in his eyes, only a quiet, stunned calculation. He stopped at Wilson's position, watching the steady, smokeless heat radiate from the small device. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit his mistake. He simply looked at James and said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier arrogance, "Private, I need you to provide a demonstration for the staff officers." The kid's toy had just become essential military knowledge. The war ended. The guns fell silent, and men like James Wilson returned home to a world desperate to forget the cold, the mud, and the scarcity. America was entering an era of unprecedented prosperity, a post-war economic boom fueled by industry, and a powerful new culture of consumerism. The mindset of making do, of improvising from trash, was a relic of the Depression and the war, a memory people were eager to shed in favor of shiny, new, mass-produced solutions. The tin can heater, a symbol of desperate ingenuity, had no place in this new world of central heating and factory-made camping gear. Military manuals were rewritten, focusing on standardized, supplied equipment. The unofficial, field-expedient knowledge that had saved so many lives in the Ardennes was never formalized, never cataloged. It was a footnote in the memories of veterans, a story told over a beer that faded with each passing year as the generation that lived it slowly disappeared. But this knowledge didn't just fade away by accident. It was buried. You have to ask why a simple, life-saving technique, proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable, was so thoroughly ignored by the institutions that followed. The answer is simple and brutal. It was not forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because it worked too well for free. A soldier who can create his own heat from discarded ration cans is a soldier who doesn't need a steady supply of kerosene. A civilian who can warm his home with cardboard and bacon grease during a power outage is a civilian who isn't a customer for large energy corporations or gear manufacturers. The entire post-war economy was built on a model of consumption and dependence. Knowledge that fosters true self-reliance is a threat to that model. It was never about what worked best. It was about what could be sold. This is why we are dedicated to unearthing these skills. If you believe this knowledge is a right, not a product, share this video and help us fight the forgetting. For decades, the buddy burner remained a piece of folklore, a dormant skill known only to a shrinking circle of veterans and old-school scoutmasters. It was a secret hiding in plain sight, a testament to a form of resilience that had been traded for convenience. But knowledge this vital can never be completely extinguished. In recent years, with the rise of the internet, small communities of people began to piece together the past. Survivalists, military historians, and prepper groups started rediscovering these forgotten techniques, sharing diagrams and personal accounts in forums and videos. They were not just looking for a camping trick. They were searching for a form of independence. They understood that the complex supply chains we depend on are fragile, and that true preparedness isn't found in an expensive catalog. It's found in the simple, powerful ideas that allow a person to create what they need from the materials at hand. The rediscovery of the tin can heater is more than a history lesson. It's an act of reclaiming a power that was deliberately taken from us. Now look around you. We no longer live in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, but our world is more fragile than we care to admit. We have become utterly dependent on complex systems we do not control. A winter storm, like the one that crippled the Texas power grid in 2021, can plunge millions into a desperate, freezing darkness. An economic crisis can make the simple act of heating your home a luxury you can no longer afford. A natural disaster can sever supply chains in an instant, leaving store shelves bare and utility lines dead. In those moments, there will be two kinds of people. There will be those who wait for help, who depend on a system that has already failed them, seeing only a cold house and a pile of useless trash. And there will be those who, like James Wilson, possess the knowledge to see something else. They will see resources. They will see a solution. They will see a path to survival where others only see an end. The lesson of the tin can heater is not just about history. It is a fundamental truth about resilience. True preparedness is not about the expensive gear you can buy. It is about the practical knowledge you cultivate. James Wilson and his squad survived not because they were issued better equipment, but because one of them remembered a simple, powerful idea. This is the kind of knowledge that has been deliberately marginalized, a skill that grants independence in a world built on dependence. If you believe this knowledge is a right that should be shared, not a product to be sold, then join our mission. Subscribe to this channel, Share this video with someone you care about and hit the notification bell. Every share is an act of resistance against the forgetting, ensuring that these life-saving skills are there for the next person who needs them. Because when the world grows cold, the most powerful tool is not what you can buy. It is what you know.